Hi everyone, it's Ardith, and today is the Elle and Hutson Christmas in July blog hop. A number of the design ambassadors have some Christmas inspiration for you, and there's a prize too. I've got all the details on my blog. I did some very simple no-line coloring in bright festive red on my monochrome card. I love the look of no-line coloring, but as a non-expert, I sometimes find it intimidating to try to do it. So I thought I would color only the berries on the Mondo holly stamp to show you some tips for beginners to no-line coloring. To begin, I got out the Essentials by Elle Mondo holly stamp set and my original size Misty so I could stamp it off the edge. I used Catherine Pooler Twilight ink. This is a light gray ink that I've used before for no-line coloring, but it doesn't completely disappear under the coloring. But I needed that here, since I wasn't planning to color the holly leaves and I needed definition in them. When I had one edge stamped, I turned the panel, cleaned the stamp, and then repositioned it to make sure that the berries would be on the panel. My wet stamp left a few marks on the cardstock, but they disappeared as they dried. When I was finished the stamping, I used the coordinating die to cut some masks from some scrap paper, and I used repositionable adhesive to attach it over top of the holly. The second mask had some ink blending on it from a previous card, so that's why it's green. But it's a good reminder that you can often use a mask more than once. I wanted to stamp some gray stripes over the top of the masked holly, so I needed to trim off the masks so that the panel would be easier to work with in the Misty. Next, I lined up the narrowest stripe from the Essentials by Elle painted stripes near the top of the panel, and I picked it up with the Misty door. When I closed the door, I made sure to give really good pressure on the stamp, especially close to the mask. Then I moved the panel up half an inch and I repeated the stamping. I used computer paper as my masks, and that's nice and thin, which makes it easier to get the ink right up to the edges. But it's still important to put that pressure down. You can actually see the ink moving toward the mask through the Misty door. I'll show you a close-up in slow motion to see if you can see it. I want to say here that you don't need a Misty to make this card. All of the stamping can be done with an acrylic block. If you do use an acrylic block, it's a good idea to have a grid behind the panel of cardstock to help you with your measuring and to keep the stripes relatively straight. I moved my panel different amounts each time, a ½ inch or 3/4 of an inch, to give a more random look, which I think works well with the painted watercolored look of that striped stamp. About halfway through, I turned the panel and I started moving it downwards rather than continuing to move it up and outside of the top of the Misty, but you could do it that way as well. When the stripes were all done, I removed the masks and I brushed off any of the temporary adhesive that got left behind. I love the look of a silver or gray card with bright pops of red, and that's where this design is going. Oh, and that wider area between the stripes is where I'm planning to put my sentiment, and I've got a not-so-funny story about that in a minute. So I'll pull in a bit here so that you can see how I colored. I started with R35, which was my lightest shade, and I colored each of the berries, leaving a white highlight on the biggest ones, and no highlight if they were small or behind some berries. My first tip for no-line coloring is to color on the lines. We're so used to coloring inside the lines that I had to remind myself of this several times. Now, as I said earlier, these lines aren't going to disappear completely, but they won't disappear at all if you don't color on them. By having them still visible, it made it easier for me to see where each berry was, and also to determine where the shadows needed to go. So that's my first tip, color on the lines. When I finished with R35, I moved to R37 and then R39 to add shadows to the left bottom of each berry. I went over about half of each berry with the midtone, and then about 1/4 or 1/3 of each one with the darker red. For the berries that were clearly behind other berries, more of them got colored with the darker colors. Finally, I went in with a 4th shade, the R89. This one is really dark, and I used it just on the bottom left edges of the berries to really bring in deep shadows. And that's my second tip. The contrast really helps to build dimension and also to give definition to each of the berries. Finally, I went back over the whole of each berry with the lightest shade again to help blend out the different shades of red. I even went over those white highlights, and they remain a slightly lighter shade of red. I used to have no end of trouble with my white gel pens, but now I find if I start it on the skin of my hand and I use a very light touch, it helps the white ink to flow better and I get better results. I added small white lines to the bigger berries on the top right side, opposite to where I put the shadows. And for the smaller berries, I just put tiny white dots. This helps make them look like they're reflecting light because they're shiny. Next, I added the sentiment. It's from Ware too, and it simply says Merry Christmas in a very small, fine type. I stamped it in black so that it would be visible. The Mondo holly has a very nice block Merry Christmas stamp, but unfortunately, I accidentally sent it through my Gemini Junior with the holly die when I was cutting the masks, and it cut the stamp. I don't mind stamp surgery, but this was cut right through the T and the M in Christmas, and try as I might, I couldn't get it back together. I'm just so happy it didn't damage my Gemini Junior. Finally, I wanted to add some sparkle, because what's Christmas without some sparkle? I used the new Avery Elle Clear Shimmer Spray. I tested it on a shoebox lid before I used it on my card, just so I could get a sense of how far away I needed it to be. It's not that easy to see in this light, but I noticed later in the evening, under the indoor lights, it was really noticeable and shimmery. To finish the card, I simply glued the stamp panel to a white card base. This one will be easy to mail. So there are my two main tips for simple, no-line coloring. Color on the lines and use a lot of contrast. By choosing a simple shape and a limited color palette like I did, you can get in some practice in a low-risk way. Who knows, maybe I'll work up to trying the leaves next. Now be sure to head to my blog for all the details about the blog hop. There is a prize, so hop and comment for your chance to win. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up below and subscribe to my channel for more inspiration. Product links are below in the description and also on my blog. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.